All right, that might be enough to kick it off. We can reward the people that showed up on time. I'm going to get started, I guess. So, hi, if it sounds like I'm reading off the script, it's because I am. You guys are going to have to forgive me again. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to a special community meeting dedicated to discussing the release of the foundation proposal. It's something that we feel is a watershed moment in the history of MakerDAO, so it's great that everybody showed up for this. This proposal will set the stage for the next few years of Maker, so we have a lot to go over today. First, let's do some introductions. We can go around the room. That doesn't make sense anymore because there's no room. I thought you guys were going to be together today. So let everybody know who we are. I'll kick it off. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the technical community manager at Maker. I'll be moderating this call with Jess. Jess, do you want to tell us a bit about you?
Yeah. Hey, how's it going? I'm Jess Solomon, and I am a more general community manager, and I'll also be helping moderate and read some of your questions off.
Cool. Rune, you want to introduce yourself and let us know what you're up to?
Hey guys, Rune here. Yeah, so I am the co-founder and CEO of MakerDAO and the foundation.
All right. Matt?
I'm coming live from our Copenhagen office.
What time is it there?
6.
Oh, that's not too bad. Matt, you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Oh, hey guys. My name is Matt Richards, and I am the president here at MakerDAO.
Cool. We have a lot of people showing up, so that's encouraging. I hope people brought some tough questions because that's what we're here for today. If you do have questions, feel free to type them into the chat if you want us to read them out. If you'd like to get on the mic yourselves, that would be awesome. Raise your hand or just type in chat that you have a question, and Jess or I will make sure that you get a forum to speak. The agenda for the meeting is we're going to walk through the document a bit, not line by line, but we'll give you guys a brief recap of what the major sections are. And as we walk through the doc, we'll stop and see if there's anything relevant that people wanted to talk about or ask, or whether they had some concerns. And we'll just move on through that. Rune, do you want to give us a brief overview of what the foundation is all about, what this document is all about, some of the elements and priorities? Give us some context.
Right. So, so the foundation is really the result of the early development team. Essentially, what we became over time is we realized we actually have to set up this entity to sort of, just like be the underlying support for the ecosystem as a whole. And what we really want to be and what we essentially already are is like what we call like the bedrock of the ecosystem, right? So the foundation is kind of like this underlying organization that takes care of all the stuff that needs to be taken care of. And in a sense, Maker is all about creating this brand new economic model, like this new ecosystem, a community, something that's never really been seen before, right? Where it's based around like unlocking freedom with blockchain technology and doing all this innovative stuff. And in order for all of these experiments to play out in a like a safe and sustainable way, it's also very important that there are people who sort of keep their eyes on the ball and essentially create an environment that allow all the people of the community to essentially experiment with the wonders of blockchain technology. So that's kind of what we want the foundation to be, essentially the bedrock that drives the project forward. And maybe sometimes does a lot of stuff that could be considered boring or like business-like or even corporate, but is necessary for it to succeed. And we're really doing this because we want to just ensure the absolute success of the project.
All right, sounds good. If nobody has any questions about the introduction there, I think we should probably start walking through the document a bit, the foundation proposal itself. The first major section I'd like to address, excuse me, is the 20% principle section, which I think it got the most feedback, excuse me, from the group. And there's a lot of questions there. So Rune, do you want to talk briefly about the 20% principle, and then we can delve into some of the questions we found?
Yeah, so the very brief overview of the 20% question, right? The 20% principle, right, is that as it's outlined, in the proposal, it is basically that, like, fundamentally, Maker has to do more than just do some financial innovation, right? We actually have to change what finance means and how it fundamentally works. And essentially, the 20% principle is just ensuring that 20% of the surplus of the system goes towards public good. And then, alongside, obviously, the major gains that are going to go to the actual, participants in the ecosystem who hold MKR.
Okay, great. We had some questions in Reddit from some of our really engaged community members. So Duster1212 asked, he wanted some more information about the principle in depth, primarily about how it will be funded. I think you kind of touched on that a bit, and what proposals you foresee. And I know that's tough to kind of guess, but what kind of things would you like to see as proposals?
Yeah, I mean, so basically it will be, just like to be very specific about how it's funded, right? It's basically that we have currently, the foundation has this development fund it consists of about 38% of the total MKR supply, so about 380,000 MKR. And the idea is to take a block of 200,000 MKR and essentially allocate that in a fund, or like in an accounting structure that essentially is able to sustainably fund this 20% to charity setup. So what's interesting is that it's not really taken directly out of the system, it's just taken out of this existing pool of development funds. And will basically cut in half what the foundation currently controls, with the other half going to business development and more short-term goals. We'll then alongside that park these 20% towards this goal of just creating this this fundamental equality functionality of the system.
That's interesting. So as the charitable fund comes out of the dev pool initially, that helps to sort of distribute Maker across the community as well. That reduces the leverage of that dev fund as well, which is that's a good benefit, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this whole question of decentralizing the dev fund, or like what to do with the fact that the dev fund is so very big, is also in a sense addressed further down in the foundation proposal, right? But it is basically that we're sort of making a strong allocation of what is this stuff actually supposed to be used for, and then also basically saying, I mean, at the same time we're saying 18%, right, of the total 38% of the total supply is going to these more short-term business development goals, essentially just going to generate the hyper growth that the ecosystem needs over the next couple of years.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to another question. I think this is going to be a big one, and it encompasses some of the concerns that we've already seen in the social medias. So charitable acts can be viewed from a bunch of different perspectives, through a bunch of different lenses, particularly if you're a business. You can view them as a marketing and PR exercise. You can view them as having some kind of tax utility, or as a social good. How do you view what do you think the primary driver is of the charitable fund?
Yeah, so this is a great question, right? And this is kind of where I'll actually make the case for why it makes sense to allocate 20% to charity, right? And I see there's basically two really, so the question is, what is the primary driver? And basically, I think there are so many drivers, and it's really hard to like identify any single one as the primary reason, or like being necessarily stronger than other arguments. But I sort of like to split it up into two parts. So I think there are what I call internal reasons, or like internal arguments for why it's good, and then external arguments, right? And first, I'll just spell out like the internal view of why 20% is important. Or in fact, this could even be argued why it's necessary. Right? So in sort of the sense of why, what it sort of contributes to Maker as a structural entity, and the community and governance as a whole. And I think the most important like place to start is actually with the governance process itself, which we'll also get to in a moment. So the scientific framework for governance that we'll also be introducing a lot more over the next couple of months leading up to multilateral launch. So basically, MKR holders, right? They have to work together in this this scientific community, essentially, this like environment of like scientific understanding and a desire to seek consensus and seek sort of common ground on how we actually control the system. Like the fundamental threat to the governance model that we believe is the strongest is tragedy of the commons, essentially, right? So it is like the idea that it could happen that MKR holders simply sort of cast aside the primary goal of having Maker be a success and being like an exercise in global cooperation, and then instead just sort of fall into like selfish patterns of just doing whatever, you know, will benefit themselves the most. And we typically describe this as like, you know, just voting for your own coins, right? That's sort of that's one of the big, I guess you could say, cultural risks to the governance model. And the solution to that is what I call an abundance mentality. So basically, the abundance mentality is the fundamental state of mind that needs to underpin our governance system as a whole and like our governance community. And the idea is basically like an abundance mentality is basically, right, like when you feel wealthy and powerful, or when you feel like fulfilled, there's like an abundance, right? And you sort of start to think about how can you not only meet your own needs, but also how can you sort of overflow essentially and get value out of, you know, like contributing to a greater good, or like working together with others, or even doing charity or something like that. And it's kind of like what we need to solve, especially in the long term, is how we can make sure that as people get, like as let's say Maker and the people in the community get increasingly successful and increasingly wealthy over time, it's very important that that results in a essentially like higher level of generosity and like higher level of like being careful and you know, essentially, right, like when as people get wealthier, it's important that that becomes a positive driver for the public good and for their desire to contribute to you know, like the governance of the system, rather than the other thing, which is actually that it could happen that success and wealth makes people more greedy, right, and it's actually more prone to tragedy of the commons. And the one path, like the abundance, like the path of an abundance mentality, means that Maker would become more and more stable and more powerful over time, and essentially stronger in this like sort of positive cycle where increased success and increased just like stability of the system creates even more success and even more stability and even better governance over time. And the other thing would kind of be would kind of be like leading like into a dead end essentially, right, where increased success of the system actually results in worse actions, which is, I mean, and this is why what we're trying to do with decentralized governance is such a grand experiment, right? Because this is kind of like the big question is, can the community even do this, right? Can the community actually work together to achieve like a common good and an open system that isn't controlled by a single entity or something? And yeah, I mean, committing to 20% charity and sort of recognizing that this is, in fact, and I'll come with some arguments about that later, but like this is not like recognizing that this is really what's expected of a system like this. It's just incredibly important for the governance, the community spirit and sort of the governance mentality to grow the right way, because this is the exact same, like the mentality that charity is good or even like necessary in society, or maybe not charity, right, but more like public good is necessary for society to function. Is this like this mindset is the same as, you know, like we need to work together to make Maker work essentially, right? Like you can't actually have a system like Maker function if everyone acts out of selfish greed, because it will actually collapse in that case. You do need some level of altruism, even in like sort of the core business function of Maker itself, right? Where you sit down and you try to, you basically say, I'm gonna try to work together with all these other people in this global community to find the best scientific models and data for setting the correct risk parameters that keep the system stable.
So besides simply being altruistic, you feel that there's a direct relationship between charitable giving and the success of the DAO itself?
Yeah, I mean, the quality of governance. Yeah, I mean, there's basically, and also there is this, I mean, not only that, but there's also like a very good, what is it called? Like parallel, like skill set, basically, where being good at doing charity and like governing charity through a decentralized governance system also makes you better at governing risk parameters themselves, right? Because it's going to be basically the same thing, where on one hand you're governing risk parameters, on the other hand you're governing charitable giving, and both of those things need to be governed in like a, like sort of basically in a sign. I mean, there were some good comments, but like some very good phrases for this, right? But like in a deliberative way, right? Like it's about thinking and then doing the right thing, kind of. And there's a very good correlation between these two things that will just make governance as a whole and the success of DAI and sort of the strength of DAI as a product stronger if there is an abundance mentality and, like even like a principle of charity in the system itself. And then there is also like some more, like in that sense, right? There's also a more like, there's a quantifiable effect, which is on one hand, like you'll generally tend, like if you have a system that supports charity versus a system that doesn't, you would generally see that selfish actors would gravitate towards the one without charity, right? And like in fact, even leave a system that does it, because just sort of, I mean, one thing is being selfish also, right? But then another thing is like being anti-charity, which in some sense could even go beyond being selfish and even being like, it's just like a moral stance of like even of like charity being bad or something, right? Of being like undesirable. And people with that kind of mindset are very dangerous for the governance process, because they will tend to not, and this is because like it's kind of like it's like almost like a psychological thing, right? But it's like about basic trust, right? It's basically about whether you believe if you do good stuff, is that actually going to result in anything good, or you're just being naive, right? And if you believe that is not the case, which means that you fundamentally lack basic trust, you would also be very unlikely to actually believe that the governance process can work at all, right? Because you'd be thinking, well, everyone else is going to vote for their own points, right? So why shouldn't I also just like vote and push for my own points?
So that's interesting. You're saying that having this sort of mentality of altruism is selecting for positive actors in the ecosystem itself. It keeps people out that are inclined to act in sort of vicious self-interest.
And it also brings good bad actors. So it keeps out bad actors and also brings in good actors, right? So like on one hand, you'll have these, like you'll basically, there'll be less people in doing risk assessment and like collateral governance who are not well suited for that, because they are sort of turned away by the charity component. But there will also be just like altruists, like good actors coming in and coming in for the sake of the charity component, who basically come in and are interested in governance because they're interested in governing charity and they're sort of attracted to that function. And as a result, they also spill over into the overall collateral governance. Because I mean, if they're happy to see charity being done, they obviously also need to participate in the overall governance, because that's what actually makes the charity possible in the first place. So yeah, I mean, that is the entire like internal argument, right? Is that it has a very profound effect on this like hive mind and the overall community that ends up running the system. And again, as we know, like this is the biggest challenge we're facing, is whether is it even going to be possible to get this done? And that's where I believe like that this is really one of the strongest tools we have available to help us actually try to achieve proper decentralized governance.
Okay, well, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. Not completely devil's advocate, because I feel the same concerns as some of the members in Reddit have had. So there's a risk that charitable giving can be viewed as a political act. And I think that you've addressed that in the document and some of your comments in Reddit, where you mentioned the concept of brand damage. It's something we need to be concerned about. It's easy to imagine that any particular initiative can be aligned with the left or the right, whatever those terms actually mean. So how does the foundation manage the perception that it's taking sides when it chooses to fund a certain initiative?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I really reject the idea that charity itself is political. I mean, in that sense, I think not like lack of charity is as much political as like the absence of charity is as much political as the existence of charity, right? But I mean, in terms of like the left and right argument and like the how this could be, for instance, considered leftist or whatever, right? Statist, maybe even there are some people out there thinking something like that, right? I mean, I think in general, most people, I mean, of course, politics don't simply boil down to left and right, but I think for most people, it's not a question of should we do charity or not. It's a question of should it be forced taxation or should it be voluntary giving, right? And that's really what a lot of it about. And that's actually where, I mean, if you frame it in that sense, Maker committing 20% to charity is really profoundly rightist, so to speak, right? Since it's voluntary. It's not about enforcing taxes on people with the threat of force, right? It is voluntarily committing to charity because there are a number of benefits for it. And by the way, I still need to get to the external benefits, but I'll just talk a little bit more about the political aspect first, right? So like, I mean, I think actually, like in terms of politics and in terms of like Maker taking a stance and so on, like I definitely believe it is very naive to think that it's possible to not take a stance, and especially if you're in finance and fully like embroiled in like regulation and strongly like within the scope and the target of regulators all over the world, right? Which I will get to in a moment. But so what's interesting about the 20% principle is that the 20% number comes from a very, like it exists, is 20% for a very specific reason. And that is, well, first of all, it's actually because it's like a round number. So it's like a good shelling point. But secondly, it's because it's very close to the average corporate tax rate in like non-tax havens, basically, in like regular countries, like real countries with real respectable companies. They typically pay a 20% corporate tax rate. So it's actually very common to pay 20% of what you earn to the public good. And yeah, like it's kind of like, I mean, as we do this, we're just positioning ourselves and saying we're not like so back to the political question, right? It's like, should we be rightist? Should we be leftist? Should we be neutral or something? I don't think it's possible to really just be neutral, which of course is kind of the ideal thing to do. But there is this notion of being centrist, right? Like being kind of like whatever works, just like sort of get, don't have an extremist opinion and just do like the middle ground and sort of what everyone else is doing. And that's what I think the number 20% really represents, right? So in my opinion, being leftist would be paying like 50% to charity or 80% to charity or something, right? And then paying nothing, I think would very much be like rightist, kind of like, now we're like, it's like, it would kind of like saying that, I mean, and of course this question is also, like it's deeply affected by the fact that crypto sort of has its roots in sort of like anarchism almost, right? And like these libertarian and anarchistic roots that really exist in, for instance, in Bitcoin for a very long time. And that's what I think ultimately for like a project like Maker at the very long term, like reaching a very large scale, if it really contributed nothing to the public good and essentially just I mean, basically, contributed nothing to the public good, essentially did a 0% to charity. That would be a right wing, like, I mean, that would be a political decision to say something like, no, we don't we don't need to contribute to equality because we're like capitalists and we do what we want, kind of. 20% is basically saying we'll just do what is already being done, right? And I think from the political point of view, I think it's like it is very important to sort of just like follow the mainstream here, because not paying, like being perceived as like a major successful corporation, like major successful project or whatever economic entity, that then, you know, doesn't contribute to public good, can be a very negative thing for like branding and so on, which we'll also get to, right? But I just think an example that's a very good example, I think, is Apple, when there was like a major scandal because it became obvious how they were avoiding tax and like holding all their money in tax havens, and were doing this. They were paying this like effective tax rate of 0.something%, right? And there was a major global public, or at least like in the Western world, like a major public outcry, and it actually resulted in legislative action against them, right? So they actually ended up getting hit by this European big business tax, which is based on revenue rather than being like a regular taxation.
So you feel that there might be some kind of regulatory appeasement, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but it might help conversations with regulators in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so that is kind of, I mean, so so the main, like, so that's where we're getting to these, like, the more short-term external benefits of committing to charity at this point, right? So it's basically that, yeah, I mean, I think the main external advantage is really the perception of regulators, right? But not tax authorities, and not like the risk of someone legislating to somehow like extract money out of the system through force, rather than us voluntarily just committing to do what is basically the mainstream business commitment at this point in time. But that is just financial regulators. So now we're talking about like getting DAI and CDPs accepted as you know, like a legitimate mainstream financial product and currency. And that's because of the way regulators think. So basically regulators, they like justify everything they do based on this idea that they're helping the weak, right? I mean, they're like protecting investors, and they're protecting consumers and that kind of stuff. And that means when they go out and they you know, something like the SEC or European regulators or Asian regulators, basically anyone, they go out and they look for bad guys, right? They like look for someone doing some scam, some trick or something, like doing something that's dangerous to the economy or dangerous to regular people or something, right? And then they sort of, you know, they're agents of justice, right? And that means they're like, and in many cases, it actually does matter a lot what they personally think. Like, I mean, the law is one thing, but also the interpretation of the law by individual bureaucrats in power is also really a major thing. And they just tend to be you know, like it completely changes everything if they immediately perceive us as, okay, these guys are obviously good guys, right? Because they've made this significant commitment to charity. Some like Lamborghini ICO dude would never do that, right? Like, I mean, they would never, like, it just puts us on a completely, like, it sort of takes us out of the crypto world and into like respectable business world, right? Because they obviously have this, I mean, in many cases there is this like negative stigma around crypto.
That's interesting. So not only not only is Maker sort of a non-predatory organization already, we tack on this added PR sort of benefit of an organization that's actually doing good. So that lowers us significantly, takes us off the top 10 list of people to look at from regulators, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the thing is, I mean, and that's in terms of the PR value of doing charity, which is also another, like, I mean, I would say regulation ranks the most important thing, or like perception of regulators, public affairs, as people sometimes call it, right? Ranks as the #1 reason why is the commitment ultimately is beneficial to growth and beneficial to, like, I mean, even to the value gained by MPR holders, right? But another thing is obviously PR. And we already are a project that has a really strong PR track record. In many ways, we are one of the only, like I would call, pristine brands in the crypto space, right? Like there isn't really anything, single thing that we held against us, which is really, I mean, that's already like that's really important. I mean, it's actually an absolute requirement for us to achieve what we want to achieve. Which is, I mean, and this is maybe something I should just sort of explain a little bit more, right? But it is, we are, like Maker really is a very unique project compared to basically any other project, even in the crypto space, because of what we're trying to do. And what we're trying to do is essentially doing a land grab for a global natural monopoly, right? I mean, we're trying to be sort of an entrenched global financial infrastructure that, if it actually goes in place, will be will in fact be impossible to remove, right? Through anything else than sort of this coordinated global action that comes out of, let's say, I mean, PR problems, for instance, right, or regulation problems, or something like that, coming out of people basically being like, why should we allow, why should we accept this this project to essentially sit on our financial infrastructure when they're not, when they're actually greedy capitalists, right? I mean, that's one way people could be thinking, or the other could be thinking, wow, we're so it's like, it's like, in fact, before Maker even reaches its saturated adoption, right? You could have people being sort of welcoming us because they'll be like, wow, I'm so looking forward to the day where Maker is broadly adopted, because that means sort of this guaranteed driver of equality, right? And that will, that's just sort of, I mean, there is this concept of the social contract, right? Of like this fundamental relationship between the public and like regular people, and then people or entities in power, right? And it's very important the social contract makes sense for everyone, or there'll be friction and eventually like instability. And 20% commitment to charity is just also like a very, strong and like solid, essentially commitment in the social contract, right? It's like very obvious for people. Why should we accept this technology? Oh, because it's kind of like built in. It's not, it's not going. It's definitely going to be a driver of good in the world, right? So
that's an interesting point, and I want to touch on it in a second. So I'm getting some feedback. I'm going to power through it. But Jess, can you wanted to address some of the questions people have been asking in chat to Rune?
Sure. So, Rune, I wanted to address a question from Jordan Crandall, who asked, do you expect that the Maker Foundation will not also be paying local corporate taxes at any point in the future?
So, so this question is, so actually before I answer the question, I mean, something that had like, so right now the 20% principle has only been described in like this broad overview of what it actually means, right? It's like 20% to charity, but there will be some, or like 20% to public good, in fact. But essentially, one thing that's going to be really important for it to be sustainable is, for instance, that let's say we do have to pay taxes, right? In the jurisdictions where the foundation is incorporated, or maybe in like, I mean, multiple jurisdictions, right? Depending on how we operate. Then this would count towards a 20% commitment, because basically, I mean, of course, we don't want our charity or like our public good to go through governance if we can avoid it. But if we get something in return, for instance, we get a good jurisdiction to operate in, then we should still be happy to do it, right? And we should in general not try to be like tax avoiders, because again, the Apple case, where it is actually perceived really badly by the public if you try to like really get out of the taxes that you owe in the sense of the spirit of the law. So the way we basically protect ourselves against having to pay corporate taxes is that we just say, well, if we do, then we count those as basically a part of the 20% principle.
Thanks.
At the same time, I do expect that we don't have to pay. I mean, I do, like, in the way that foundations can be set up, and if you look at something like the Ethereum Foundation, typically it is like there's a very good, there's a very good tax environment for nonprofits supporting open source software projects.
And Jordan asked a question in the same vein. He says also, is the 20% intended to go to projects related to DAI, like Bifrost, or could it possibly be used to pay Maker developers to work on other projects? Or is it expected to give to some organizations that have nothing to do with DAI?
Well, I mean, this is up to Maker governance. But let me get into so in the very short term, right? I mean, it would definitely be exactly about like funding stuff like Bifrost, right? And the kind of initiatives we're already doing in the charity space. In fact, Maker is kind of already a brand in the charity sector as like a technology provider. And we'll just, interestingly, it turns out this is actually a key market for us. Like it's a place that's very ready to actually adopt new financial technologies. But yeah, I mean, and obviously the point of our charity is that it needs to involve, so what we're all about is we're building this global financial ecosystem that levels the playing field for everyone in their access to finance. And we're sort of making it possible. If you're unbanked, you can now have a bank on you can have a bank account on your phone. And then by also committing to equality, in addition to just equality of access to finance, but also just like equality in terms of capital, basically, or like distribution of capital. It means we, not only can we do projects where we go out and set people up with a bank account on their phone, right? But we can also literally give them money, like give them DAI. And I think that angle is basically also just looking at charity really as marketing or like adoption, right? Like, I mean, we're just paying for adoption in a sense because we could pay for ads everywhere and tell people buy DAI, right? Use DAI. Or we could just literally give them DAI. And what's also really good is this, like the correlation between sort of who you're trying to target and who sort of the ideal user of DAI is. And in terms of like how much of a difference we can make for the individual user, it definitely is sort of the unbanked and the underprivileged, and maybe even the people in conflict zones and like victims of starvation and that kind of stuff, who really are the ideal DAI user in terms of how can we get this explosive adoption and explosive growth that we're looking for.
So sort of ties back to the last question I wanted to ask you about the 20% principle. You mentioned that you want to ensure that DAI becomes a global engine for equality. And that's a broad statement, so I'm wondering if you can maybe define that for us.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess you can think of that in terms of of what is in opposition to, right? And that is basically imagine Maker as a global engine of inequality, right? Like what if 50 years from now, there's like the global Maker elite who sit on the, kind of like an Illuminati style circle of greedy capitalists who control the world's financial infrastructure. And of course, I mean, it's not guaranteed that that's what would be the case if we don't build in sort of an equality driver into the core of the system, or like the core of the project, the community. But it certainly wouldn't be surprising because historically, technology typically tends to centralize wealth, right? And it's kind of like the people who are already struggling, they don't even have, they don't have time to like switch over to adopt new technology and like gain the benefits from it before the people who are already in good shape, they have sort of tried to capture as much of the gains as possible. And this is just like natural. I mean, it's kind of like naturally how economics basically work and like commerce and so on, right? I mean, it's also just like this. It's basically as technology becomes stronger, labor and individual humans and their value sort of decreases, right? Because humans are starting to basically compete directly with software in many cases. And that's why, I mean, people are talking about basic income, which by the way is also obviously, I mean, in general, like a buzzword that makes sense for that. I mean, I believe that it makes sense for the Maker project to really attach itself to, right? I mean, it would be really great to see DAI as the currency of basic income and kind of like a thing that all people who are proponents of basic income are attracted towards. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something where, like you could easily run into PR issues from the kind of people who already have some skepticism towards capitalism and technology and so on, right? And then really apply that to something like a freaking banking system on the blockchain, right? And again, having this charity commitment as a core part of the community spirit or the governance philosophy completely changes that, right? I mean, it just completely kind of like on one hand, we have all these like competitive business reasons and even like structural reasons, like internal reasons for why we needed to function. And as well as all the external PR reasons and all this stuff, right? So it's sort of like it's a profitable decision in a sense, right? Because we're creating new users, we're giving money to the kind of users we want, and we're also at the same time just like nullifying any type of like resistance to to the idea that technology is good for the world right now. Rather, like I mean like the fear of new technology, and especially how that can manifest itself in, again, like problematic politics or laws or so on.
So that's interesting. So we can look at it from, if we wanted to be enormously pragmatic, we sort of open the door to this huge long tail of humanitarian agencies or humanitarian focused organizations viewing DAI as being a more attractive option, right? Well,
yeah, I mean, absolutely the I guess like the charity sector itself, but I also just mean like the general people and essentially like democracies and how they respond to the rise of Maker, right? And just as an example, right? I think it's like the power of democracy and how the interaction of democracy with the blockchain, like cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, I think cannot be overstated, basically. And I think the perfect example is what happened in South Korea, where there actually was this like momentum for a ban essentially on cryptocurrency in South Korea, and then the people revolted. So like regular people started like sending angry emails to the president, pretty much. And the president himself was like, okay, this is a political risk for me, and he went out and was the first to like go out to the people and reassure them, no, we're not going to ban crypto. Like don't worry, I'm not going to mess with your bitcoins. And this is the kind of entrenchment Maker needs to have in every single country in the world, right? I mean, we need to fundamentally convince every person that Maker is good for them, right? And if their government tries to mess with us, they're really messing with the people. It's like it's not they're neglecting their mandate of being like a representative of the people, because obviously the people wants Maker, right? Like the people wants to support a project that just it does everything right? I mean,
that's interesting. I hadn't considered it from that angle.
Yeah,
right, we're coming up on the 45-minute mark, and we haven't gotten through 20% of this doc yet. So, Jess, do we have any more questions from the community that you wanted to go through?
Sure. So there is a question coming from James Moreau that is very much aligned with the next section of the document. James asks, in the spirit of engagement and having people who want to engage in the process of governments, I'd like to know how you'll approach this tactically. So reminders, accountability, etc.
Sorry, that was a little bit difficult for me to parse. So like how we get people to engage with governance?
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a question. I mean, fundamentally, there's been so many attempts at like really solving this in some crypto economic way, or like figuring out some fundamental incentive. But we've had to basically concede that this is like ultimately people have to engage directly in governance out of their own free will, essentially, right? Like it has to be Maker holders who then decide, okay, I want to contribute, and I'm going to be a part of the governance process. And so the best we can do to make it really enticing and get a broad, broad engagement, broad involvement, is to make it really easy. Which of course is like that's a very difficult thing, of course, because we're like governance, like financial governance, is an incredibly difficult subject, basically. But so what we want to do is ensure that like the people who can participate in sort of the fundamental, actual, like I would say like low-level governance, like the actual governance, they of course should be like fully invited and like sort of fully accepted based on just their, like the fact that they can, kind of, right? I mean, and this kind of how a scientific community works, right? I mean, if you're in a scientific community, if someone comes in and they have something legit to say, you listen to them. You don't care who they are. You only care about what they say, right? So there'll be this like complete openness in terms of who can participate at the low level. I mean, no, low level, high level, depending on how you think of it, right? I mean, like the hardcore level of governance for like actual financial experts, right? But we also want, I mean, everyone else to be able to participate, right? So one thing is if you're like a regular guy A way you can participate is, for instance, just choosing who other people you trust, and sort of vouching for them, right? Which can manifest itself, for instance, through vote delegation, which is also a question I saw asked a lot, right? Like whether this feature will exist, and the answer is it will, but not at launch. Like it'll come probably a couple of months after launch. It's kind of like, I mean, but it'll be there very quickly, and it will definitely be like a defining part of the governance process. The other thing is also just we will make these like higher level of sort of easier governance that sort of people can participate in depending on their experience and their knowledge, right? So, for instance, if you like, I mean, because everyone always has something to contribute, and ultimately every person, their input is valuable if it's just like dealt with in the right way. And something we're thinking of for the future is like these very easy to use interfaces where you can go in and you can like rank the coins you like, the tokens you like. You can like write any knowledge or opinion you have about basically anything, and it will sort of be included. Like it'll be be taken in and will dealt with as data essentially. And then you can decide how deep you want to go. Do you just want to like rank your 10 favorite coins, or do you want to like grade every single token based on different characteristics that you know about, such as like the team, their business model, and the idea is that there'll be like this, there'll be different stuff to do for different people, and everyone who sort of makes the decision. Okay, I'm actually gonna I'm gonna show off my abundance mentality here and actually decide to go in and participate in the system. And then there should be something for them to do, right? Of course, it'll take a while to get the full vision of this realized, but again, I mean, the project as a whole obviously has a very long timeline, and it's something that shouldn't take too long to make either, because at this point we have some really serious teams working on this issue.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left in this meeting, and it actually went amazingly from my perspective. I'm glad that we focused so long on the 20% principle. I'm thinking that there's 4 other major sections in the foundation proposal that we didn't get to at all. So we should talk about having more meetings, I think, and maybe explore those in another forum just like this. Before we shut it down, though, there's some general community questions that I wanted to get to, just sort of non-specific, but people were interested and they wanted to ask you, Rune. So Mo Seng, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He asks, who are Maker's competitors, and are we putting aside any efforts to learn from them to improve the Maker system? So I guess the question is, are we looking at our competitors in the space, and are we willing to take their ideas, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, so this who are Maker's competitors is like a very interesting question, right? Because obviously that is one of the things we spend most of the time thinking about from the business perspective. And what's interesting is that in some sense the answer is there are none. Like in the broader stablecoin space, obviously there are a lot, right? I mean, especially nowadays where there's like a new stablecoin popping up every week. But they're kind of like, there are 3 types of stablecoins, right? And the first kind is like the Tether model, right? It's the IOU, where you have this trusted entity that has a bank account or something, and then they create a token, and you trust them to redeem your token for you when you want to, right? I mean, I would say the biggest player there is Tether, obviously, but they have PR issues, potentially legal issues. Then there's TrueUSD, which is just like a solid project taking this model. And then there's the upcoming Circle coin, US dollar coin by Circle. And I think all of those, I mean, I would kind of put those 3 projects almost like at the same level. I mean, maybe TrueUSD is a little bit less or something, but they also have their advantages, right? I mean, because they're legit, they don't have PR issues, unlike Tether, for instance. But they're still relatively small, but they're having like decent growth and stuff. But anyway, so the thing about this entire model as a whole, I don't think that it's possible for this model to scale at all in the same way that DAI can, Maker can, right? Because they're not decentralized. So like, it's just like a different product essentially, because let's say, for instance, you're building a dApp. If you build it on top of something like Tether or TrueUSD, it's no longer a dApp, right? It just became an app because you're actually building it on top of a bank. And underneath your product, there is a bank that is essentially the platform you're building on, because they're the ones who, in a sense, they have to agree to everything you're doing. And if they don't, you're in trouble, because they will actually, I mean, they can and they will seize your funds, freeze them or whatever, right? Like, but where they do have a really nice role, and where they play really well with Maker, is that the great on-ramps for DAI, right? And in fact, I'm really looking forward to TrueUSD going on the Ocean, which is one of the new 0x decentralized exchanges. And the fact that you'll be able to then, from there, you'll be able to use TrueUSD as an on-ramp for DAI. So you can very easily go dollars to TrueUSD to DAI in a way that's much easier than what you currently have to do. And basically the same for every other of these coins. And they can even be used as collateral. Of course, it's not really a long-term type of collateral, obviously, because there's no, why would anyone lock up? Like, I mean, here the age-old question of why do you want to lock up $1,000 to generate 500 DAI? Here it actually becomes true, right? Because you are literally locking up dollars to get less dollars. But it does make sense if you're a market maker. So what it means is that market makers and basically traders who sort of facilitate the on-ramp and off-ramping of DAI into these IOU tokenized currencies will have extreme levels of liquidity. So that means the spread and sort of the cost of going in and out of DAI will be really low. And we try really hard to work together with all of these projects and just make sure that we're really well integrated with them as on-ramps, as collateral, and sort of like, we want to position DAI as sort of the central point in this network of all these different tokenized currencies. And then they are sort of the gateway into the real world. So yeah, so on one hand, they're competitors, right? But on the other hand, we also synergize with them. Then on the other side, you got the freaking senior shares models. So these are the crazies, you could say, right? I mean, these are the stable coins that want to print money out of thin air. And there's a lot of them, and they're the ones that are really popping up every day. There's like a new guy who's got a great idea. And what they all have in common is basically they're sort of guaranteeing stability today by sort of, I guess, selling stability in the future, or like compromising stability in the future. So yeah, I mean, it's very likely that a system like that will eventually crash, at least if it reaches a very large scale. And I think also it's likely that they will sort of all crash at the same time. So basically all the senior shares models will be interlinked because they're all based on the fundamental same idea, which is, can you create money out of thin air, right? And if the answer to that question is no, you can't, there's no reason why anyone would trust any senior shares coin, right? So when one of them collapses, it could easily result in all the others collapsing as well. So they're only really competitors in a short-term sense, and especially also they're competitors for capital, right? I mean, they're competitors for people who may choose to engage themselves in Maker or maybe in some senior shares coin. Yeah, I mean, in terms of what we're learning from these projects, I guess we're learning from the IOU coins that, we're sort of learning their legal strategy, and we're also trying to like figure out how we can best interact with them synergistically and use them in ways that benefit both projects and ultimately helps DAI's role to become this like future global financial infrastructure.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and this is potentially going to open up a can of worms, but Today just asked a really interesting question in the chat. Jess, do you want to summarize that for us and see if we can get through it in the next 5 minutes?
Sure. So today, ask an interesting question. In order to get MKR holders to vote, MakerDAO must incentivize the time we put into making these difficult decisions. So smaller holders with valuable information on risk management, non-political charitable decisions, etc., have less incentive or little incentive to vote and play a role in governance. The amount of people in this meeting proves this. What are your thoughts on paying MKR holders to vote?
Yeah, I mean, so this sort of comes back to what I was talking about before, right? This question of engaging people and how we can do that. And is it possible to construct some decentralized mechanism that just solves the problem? And for instance, paying people to vote doesn't solve this issue, right? Because then it just means anyone who holds MKR will now just vote for. I mean, if there are already people who would have voted, who would sort of engaged and voted on out of their own volition in an intelligent way, they will still do that. And if they weren't, if they're sort of selfish actors, all right, or just like apathetic voters, right, who just don't really want to spend the time to vote correctly, they will just vote for something random. So there has to be some level of control, right, about like, we have to pay people who not only vote, but also actually contribute. And maybe what's important is not so much paying people to vote and getting people to vote. It's actually more about getting people to positively help the, like contribute to the scientific discourse, right? And like the helping reach this like solid scientific consensus. And I mean, so like basically, this is definitely something we want to do, right? And we've basically like the way to do it though is in a way where you're sure when you pay people, you actually get something out of it, right? So it's not like you can sort of like pay here and there and then like, I mean, because that again becomes a system that's easy to abuse, right? So fundamentally, it's really about paying experts and sort of having experts providing this like, again, like the bedrock of the scientific community, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Paying experts is definitely worth exploring. I think I have personal concerns. I think that anytime you incentivize a vote, you're basically inviting coalitions and cartels at that point, because we're dealing with a demographic.
Sorry, let me just so again, it's not a matter of paying people to vote or like paying experts to vote, right? It's about, I mean, the fundamental part of the scientific framework, which we didn't get to at all now. But again, I think it's a good, I mean, basically, the main point to talk about today is the 20% principle and is charity, because that was the only thing where people actually have real concerns, right? And there's real contention. But the scientific governance framework that we are proposing fundamentally includes this like this element called risk teams, which are basically, in some sense, they're almost like oracles, right? Or they're essentially experts who are, I mean, they're not trusted in the same way as oracles. I mean, they're not given authority at the level of the system, right? But they're given social authority in a sense, right? I mean, they're people who the community votes to pay money so that they can output legitimate scientific results, right? And models and stuff that they can, so they will kind of be the guys who, again, just like the foundation is guys, like they'll do the boring stuff in many cases, right? Like they'll be the guys laying the groundwork, doing the stuff that nobody else wants to do and you have to get paid to do it. They will do that, and they will then present it and sort of make everything more easily digestible for the members of the community who are just enthusiasts. And once you reach that point, right, where you have this, like, the boring stuff is done and we can focus on whatever interests us, that's when you really have a much bigger chance of getting sort of the armchair economists, or maybe even like, I mean, just like the experts who have another full-time job, basically, right? Like they can then come in and be like, okay, I can spend 5 minutes on just like, let's say, just like giving a simple response to the material that the risk teams produce, for instance. And the key thing about the risk teams is that they must be decentralized, right? So like the idea is there has to be many of them, and they have to be sort of independent, so spread out and almost competitive in a sense, right? Like that, so that we don't have the problem of, for instance, getting like just one team, sort of ultimately making most of the research, and then it's wrong, and then suddenly there's a huge problem, right? But rather, just like in everywhere else, we need to apply the principle of diversification and decentralization as much as possible.
All right, thanks for that. You're right, it is a huge topic, and I think that's probably one that deserves a meeting all on its own. So I think we'll probably reconvene next week and continue on if everybody's available. And Jess and I will make sure that the questions that got asked in chat that weren't answered, we'll carry those over and make sure everybody's aware of the meeting in Twitter and Reddit for our next agenda. All right, thanks, Rune. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks for everyone asking questions.
All right. We'll be posting a recording of this on our YouTube channel as well. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.